Great.
Magic. All right. Hello, Dr. Heckman. There's Patty. Excellent. And there's Angelina. All right. So let's just go ahead and get started because I'm sure we have a lot that we want to go through today. Everyone can see my slide deck, correct? Okay. So first things first, just if you hadn't seen or heard the news, I will be leaving the Center for Community Solutions. So I'm leaving at the end of the month, and I'll be working at a company called Uvo Health. I'll still be here in Cleveland. They work on value-based contracting with federally qualified health centers, but I will be still helping Community Solutions in a couple of ways, including making sure that this project finalizes. So nothing should really change for that. The majority of the work is essentially done, so should not be a problem, but I'll still be around, can help, can continue to engage around this work when we, are talking about putting out information to the community, testifying before city council, that sort of thing. So we should be good there. But I'm excited about today because I think there's a lot that we can go over. Now, what I'd like to do to organize this conversation is first, I want to provide some context, okay? I think it's really important that when we're talking about this sort of work, that we ground it in what it is and what the intent of the project is, and then what the intent of the project is moving forward. Because even though we can say, the action plan and the assessment work has been done, it's really now time for the rubber to meet the road. But the rubber meeting the road means a lot of things, and not everything that can be captured in the action plan. So I want to talk about that context. Then we can get into the document itself. Hopefully you had a chance to review it. For the most part, we have some time here. Our plan is to release sometime in mid-January. So when we think about how this document is displayed and what it means and how to communicate it, we can have those discussions. I received feedback already. We can go through some of that feedback about maybe changing some terminology, maybe making clear some of the intent, that sort of thing. And that's why I'm glad to see Ebony and Patty here today, because a big piece of this work is going to be how do we communicate it out to the community and how do we leverage it moving it forward. So we'll review that, talk about the communications efforts, and then really closing out the project itself. What can you expect? How is that going to move forward? That sort of thing. So let's get into it. All right, context. So first of all, one of the things why I put out that video too. Russ Akoff is like a systems thinker, right? We've heard the term, we might have heard the term systems thinking. We know that quality improvement is, sort of a la mode, if you will, when it comes to healthcare. And that context that he was providing, I think, was really important. In quality improvement, what we say is that the definition of quality is whatever the customer says it is. And I think that that's something that we have to realize, is that this process has really tried to center the community voice in ideating and generating concepts that try to move beyond just understanding a problem, assessing a problem, and moving it into action. However, with that creative act, right, coming up with ideas, doing something new, it's a discontinuity. And what I want to highlight here is that it can be uncomfortable, right? What you all have decided to do as a community, as a number of stakeholders, is not only try to highlight the needs of the community, but say, we need to go beyond documentation. We can't just create something to understand where Lakewood is. We need to also try to figure out what are some opportunities moving forward. And with that, it creates tension naturally, because you're interrupting the way things are. right? And when you do that, it means that the typical way of doing things might not be good enough. And when you think about changing behaviors or changing institutions or changing the way that a whole community might approach certain things, obviously there's a need then to redress how that conflict arises and do so in a way that still maintains the values of being community centered, of addressing the values that we highlighted, say, in the action plan review. So I say that to say the uncomfortableness of the process is a good thing, because you're doing something that a lot of communities have never done. So when we talk about values and results, right? What were some of our values when we initiated this? We wanted to be community centered and grassroots. We wanted to make sure that when we are working on these projects, it's not just top down. You're not just inviting a consultant to say, here are the 10 policy proposals that you need to implement to go do in order to fix these issues. Instead, what we try to do is say, let's understand how people's perceptions and the numbers line up. And then let's figure out, too, their perceptions around how to address those things. And let me just say, with that, then you lose technical expertise, you lose nuance, you lose the interconnectedness that people might bring when they do represent that expert opinion, right? I have ideas about, say, the connector, the community connector, right, Dave? But Dave actually knows what it takes to get done. And that's the translation point that we'll be dealing with. So the results of that are that the ideas that were put forward, and their ideas, it's not a promise to do work. They're generative and they're open. They're not technical. So some of the things that you were evaluating, right, real short, less property taxes. The implications of something as simple as that are much broader, and that's what gets into our deeper recommendations. We are also trying to be trauma informed. That means that even if the feedback was challenging, or even if it was patently not true, that we treated it as valid, but it does not mean it's validated by this. So, if someone says, oh, this is a good idea, it doesn't mean in application it may be a good idea for a whole host of reasons. And that's where the future effort is about taking those concepts and really going through more rigorous application so that you can determine, how do we get this done? There's also democratic and transparent. So, we wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to participate. This is why we spent so much time developing the charrettes and doing the in-person stuff, because we wanted to create multiple opportunities. And the result of that is it was inclusive and open. People had those opportunities. We were not limiting individuals' abilities to participate. And then finally, we wanted accountability through future action. This is not a recipe. This is not the fully baked cake of addressing the needs assessment. This is an action plan, not a guarantee. So regardless of wherever those measures might be, even if they're highly ranked or more lowly ranked in that prioritization list, it's just a plan. It's a way to set the agenda for discussing how to move this forward. And the thing I want you to remember here is this is a new way of doing this work. There are not many communities across the country that have done something like this. A lot of folks have done assessments. They've tried to gauge community issues, but translating that into action, into policy, into funding is not a typical endeavor. So with that, there comes some messiness, but being new isn't necessarily being bad, right? So a couple of things to highlight in terms of our timeline. We started with an assessment. We wanted to define the challenges. And really the key thing there was to collect data and feedback from the community, curate it, provide information in a public way. The action plan is about brainstorming and prioritizing potential actions. Brainstorming, I think, is one of these overused terms, but in quality improvement, there's an actual process to that. Charrettes are a type of brainstorming activity. And we are saying, we're just going to collect ideas. We're going to see what people have to say about some of these needs. And ultimately, what the action plan represents is a prioritized list alongside some recommendations for how to manage that list. So then you all as the community can go ahead and implement, right? That's what's next, is implementation. So to do that, you need to figure out a governance process and a review process. And that's why we highlighted a few specific things, and most notably, the creation of a public-facing body, what we call the standing committee in the action plan, that can help make determinations about, hey, what do we think about this idea? Is this idea have merit? Are other people working on this? Where are there gaps? Where does this not make sense? How do we evaluate this? And then use something like the implementation tool that we highlighted, to create some standard ways to communicate out how we evaluate those ideas. Are they practical? Can they be implemented and operationalized? Did we collect the feedback from the right folks before we went ahead and tried to move forward on an idea? And there's a specific example I want to bring up that came out through the process. So last piece here, right? What the action plan is and is not. It's a prioritized list of brainstormed ideas from the community. It is not a promise that all items will or should or could be implemented. It is a document outlining recommendations and a process to review those community needs and ideas from and approve it. It is not a formal governmental contract or action like legislation or a funding item. Dave is not beholden to implementing the connector, even though it was highly ranked, right? It's just something that says, hey, Dave, you should take a look at this and do that with the community. It's a way for a public-facing body to review ideas and build on concepts from the community and standardize that review. It is not a detailed list of fully vetted interventions ready for deployment and execution. So it's really important here to understand what we're trying to do is create some definition here, but ultimately a plan is just that, best laid plans. You have to go do the work to determine if it's successful or not. And, as with any plan, things may not go exactly according to plan, or you may have to be adaptable or evolve your plan. I don't know if anyone's been doing any holiday shopping recently, but whatever your best laid plans might be, it may not always work. For example, we just finished our Christmas cards. About half of them had incorrect addresses. So great plan, need to remanage that, right? So some additional thoughts that I just want to offer you before we get into the review, and I want to sort of get kind of your feedback on some things. First of all, the governance of the standing committee. I want to highlight a few things that I think we would want to include or edit the document to reflect regarding governance, because I think we still need to suss out some of the details about how technically the city could establish a standing committee. So I need to, work with Dave and the folks at the city to figure out, are there limitations on some of this governance? But some things to think about. Number one, if there's any organization that's listed in those ideas, that the standing committee should require input of that organization before moving forward. In other words, if you're going to try to move forward with something in the schools, you should invite the schools. And I have an example later. Number two, the committee is not required to use the entire list. So we have lots of different interventions, right? Dozens of different ideas that are out there. There's no mandate that the standing committee has to go through all of them. It really is just a way to prioritize which ideas bubbled up as being most consistent with the values of the work. The committee can also be a forum to more deeply articulate concepts, consult with experts, and identify potential partners. So another thing is, let's say you're looking at a really more concrete idea, a really highly scored item, like the source of income protection proposal. Well, there are people who provide technical assistance. There are landlords who might be impacted by that. There are building and housing interests that may be able to better inform how you lay that out. So, you want to bring in those people to say, this is what it would take to get done. This is how it would work in the context of council. Here are the limitations for a single government, that kind of thing. And let's also remember, there's going to be a very large data file at the end of this process. One that has hundreds of different data points on demographics, on survey feedback, so on and so forth. And there are things that we may not have even conceptualized, or questions we may not have ever asked that could be asked by this group investigated. And so new ideas that were never captured in this process could emerge. If something as simple as, we need to improve pedestrian safety comes out, well, maybe we can talk about, well, let's look at the people from Ward 2 and what they thought about that particular question and how it related to demographics, perceptions of safety, whether or not they were parents. You can really dive more deeply into the work. And so that public data file could lead to new ideas happening, and this standing committee could be a good forum for that. So one example that I want to highlight that demonstrates how the utility of the action plan could or could not work, and that deals with the recommendation around the anti-racism task force. In the action plan, you will notice the third to last ranked item was merge the anti-racism task force with the community advisory committee so that the issues of race and equity are more consistently included in the advisory committee's work. Now, on its face, right, prima facie, that's not necessarily a bad concept. The idea that the community advisory committee should be thinking about things of race and equity. That's obviously something that came up. It was the highest ranked value in our review process. But, hearing some feedback, right, that may not work from a governance standpoint. There's things that the ARTF are specifically tasked with doing that may be interrupted by that sort of thing. And just because it's on that list doesn't mean that it needs to be addressed. Let's also remember too that the prioritization process indicated that particular item was pretty low. So there's other work to be done in the social and community connectedness space that has nothing to do with that. That's the first thing. And the second thing is when you look across the scores and you see where the score happened, the value around promoting equity was pretty low specifically for that item. So if we know that's the highest value and the committee's thinking about considering it, it may not be the easiest, it may not be the best thing to try to prioritize and have emerge through the process. And it also gets to the point that I was making before of, you should bring in the ARTF to provide that expertise to say where, there may be some utility or maybe where that concept could be better refined. Also, the ARTF is represented here on the advisory committee. Our hope is that the advisory committee ultimately becomes the standing committee, or at least is inclusive of that membership. So they should be a part of that governance process. So you want to maintain that level of inclusion. And then you have to think about the context, right? The standing committee is not an all-powerful body. What it should be doing is serving as a platform to vet these ideas, bring partners to the table, publicly discuss them, and then work with the city, foundations, and other institutional partners to say, hey, how can we support this work? What's the best way to get this done? And how do we leverage the data that we collected to address some of these notions? Okay. So I want to take a moment there to pause because I know we have to go through the review process and see if anyone had any feedback or thoughts about that so far. Does it make sense? Does that help sort of contextualize the action plan?
Lauren, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. No, I appreciate you going through and clarifying and making it clear a little bit what the action plan is and what it is not. I guess in my mind, for me, it was pretty clear, and perhaps even thinking, okay, maybe we don't call it an action plan, but it's something else might be helpful and something to consider. I think you had mentioned that. And then I also just wanted to say in my mind, again, the standing committee to me is, I don't know if workhorse is the correct terminology, but really I see the standing committee as sort of being, in my view, they're the ones sort of pushing things and pushing things ahead, because again, you had that grassroots community input that now you need somebody to champion these ideas and these thoughts. And so you really, the standing committee really needs to be a group of doers, a group of influencers that can make things happen. So influencers for, perhaps policy, people who can work on sort of those policy aspects, because some of the recommendations will take some policy movement. So really my view, the standing committee is less sort of advisory and more action and doing and pushing and influencing and guiding and maybe being a little bit fiery and saying what needs to be said and guiding things, all while keeping in mind that community voice that is at the center of what we're doing. So the community voice are sort of, I guess, I don't, trying to use a car analogy, but the community voice is at the center, and the standing committee is sort of is making sure that that community voice is moved forward.
That's exactly right. And I really do appreciate that. I think, you know, too, I agree with your point about what's the right language here. And I will follow the will of you all. I definitely think an action plan, heavy on the plan, is a good way to describe this. I think one thing that I heard a suggestion around, which I think is good, is as opposed to calling them actions, maybe calling them community suggestions, ideas, brainstormed, you know, concepts, something that maybe makes it clear, like, this is not a promise. These are not the things that we're going to go do. These are just the things that we're going to discuss. And here are the ones that bubbled up to the top. Because we'll go over the matrix and how these things scored. You know, it's a similar situation where we also can leverage this to say, you know, like the eliminating tax question didn't score well. So maybe that's not worth the focus of this doing group, right? And that's really the point, is to say, let's hone in on those things where the community is telling us to focus, where we think there's some continuity here in our values. And by doing so with this sort of public facing entity, it enables the community to feel that participation a little bit better, and also addresses a fundamental thing that we saw lacking in some of our process here, which was a centralized way to communicate with the community about some of these things.
Yeah, and I like the terminology intervention, and because, you know, I think it, and again, we sort of have to be careful using the scientific terminology and all those things, but in thinking about it, because it's some of these interventions might not work, and I also think it's going to take, or they might need to be tweaked. So I think, because the intervention, the suggestion might not be the solution, because we might apply this and realize, wait a minute, there's this whole other issue going on that is driving this issue that came up. So this is what we need to do. So, but I do like the terminology intervention versus solution, because some of these might not be the solution. They may be an intervention, which helps us get at the deeper root and ultimately come up with the solution.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, our inspiration here is democracy. And last time I checked, democracy can be a mixed bag, right? You know, so that's part of it. Is what's great about a process like this is that it enables the creativity we talk about, and that discontinuity, like I said, can be uncomfortable, but it's okay, because you can always come back. You can try new things. And that too is, to me, the power of bringing together some of the partners we have here between the city and foundations and, you know, medical providers, because you can try to pilot some ideas. You can try to experiment, and some may not work, and some may actually lead to different types of discoveries that are good. And all of that, you know, just, I think, wouldn't happen without some sort of intentional governance entity. And really, this just provides you a way to say, okay, so what do we look at? You know, what do we look at first? And how do we discuss that? Who do we need to have at the table? So I really appreciate those comments. Great. Anyone else have any other thoughts? Okay. Dive right in. Get into the action plan. Okay, so we, like I mentioned, we've already received some feedback. This is the version that I sent out. rather than the version we're sort of editing. I saw, there's a couple of typos in there. That kind of stuff will be cleaned up. But let me actually share the actual copy. How about that? Patience. Okay. And you can see all this, correct? Okay, so we wanted to maintain some of the consistency visually for our review here. I'm gonna back this out just a little bit. You can see here it's much more straightforward, not as much context. I think we'll want to add a lot on governance, but let's just walk through it. First of all, I want to highlight Kate Ingersoll. She was really helpful. We got connected with someone from the community who gave us a bunch of pictures for the city of Lakewood. I would say if you have any high def photos you want to share, send them our way. We can include those in our communications materials, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But first of all, sort of the introduction is reiterating some of what we talked about, but centers the fact that this following report is the action plan report. Any questions about the introduction? Okay, pretty straightforward. Methodology. I think it's really important. So first of all, I think I might have been one of 3 people who ever used the term charrette before this process. I guarantee all of you will remember charrette for the rest of your lives after. I want to appreciate your participation in that. In here, we highlighted how we went through it in terms of collecting the community input and some of the numbers behind it in terms of both the virtual version where we had about 40 people and 170 different types of pieces of input influence some of this, and then of course the in-person charrettes where we show what one of the posters looked like and discuss that. Any questions about the charrette section of the methodology? Pretty straightforward. Feel like you got that. Okay. The evaluation process and setting the priorities. So we talked a lot about this over several months. I realized too that this is complex and different. So we talked about how we went through the evaluation criteria, what the definition is, and then here are the weights. So to explain, and I appreciate everyone here responding to our initial survey about weights. What these are whole number representations of the percentage average for everybody who submitted. So that means these are averages of the totality. Every time I see Laura's, sorry, real quick, I see like Elf in the background. It's just really hilarious. So you're killing it today with the Elf background. That's great. So you can see here where people landed, all of you landed as an average in terms of those weights. That means when it comes to impact on outcomes, the weight was 16.2, so 16.2%. Promotes equity was by far the largest weighted value. And so this I think demonstrates to me at least why weighting the process is really important, right? Because it gets to the values that you all are trying to represent through this process and as a community, that it's not just equal share, impact, equity, complementary about money. It's that something that matters to Lakewood is that this work resolves to have Lakewood be a more inclusive and equitable community, and that more than 1/4 of the weight in the evaluation went there. I think that is something that you all should feel pretty good about, or at least when we talk about communications, is important to understand that, as a community, this is really an important value that you share. Complementary, 9.4, investment, 9.1, which ended up being the lowest one, right? So cost, apparently not a barrier, but obviously when it comes to the rubber in the road, we'll get there. Leadership capacity, also very important. Immediacy, this can happen, somewhat important. And stakeholder support, very important. So between stakeholder support and impact on outcomes, some parity there. And really what this says is the three most important things through this process are that it impacts equity, that it results in something, and that people like it, right? So that gets into the governance process. Before I move on, did the weighting process make sense? Are you clear on that? Do you have questions about it? Okay, not seeing any. So we will move on. Okay. Reading the scores. Now, obviously, this is, you know what I personally love to do? I personally love to put equations in public-facing documents. However, I thought it was really important that people could understand how these things were derived and that we give a certain sense of what that may mean. So first of all, the Likert score, right, was the 1 to 5 scoring that you had. I had some questions like, hey, there were some that I didn't understand, so I just gave them a 3. I don't know if that makes sense. Or, this one seemed like a good idea, but I was really concerned about how it impact the following, so I gave it a 1 on this following metric. All of that is okay. What you have to understand is part of this is we're blending the math with perception and just trusting in the process of collective insight to say, is this a good idea or not? And it's okay if, for example, you scored something low because you didn't understand it, because what that would do is it would average out with other people's opinions. And in all likelihood, in looking into the data, you shared a lot of that type of perspective with other people. So if there wasn't a lot of detail, or you didn't feel like you understood it, or you just were unsure about it, giving it a low score is not a bad thing. All it means is that it may not be the thing you need to prioritize, but we still wanted to represent it in the list. So when you look at this, what we can see here are the averages across these. So whether it was something like impact or equity or complementary, investment, leadership, immediacy, or support, you'll see where people highlighted their overall scores. And this is particular to the example of the source of income law. So what you do is you take your Likert scale score, the average score, multiply that times the weight it represents, and that gives you a total. And what we're doing here is we're overemphasizing the value versus the perception of the idea. And then that gives you a potential total score in any given intervention of 500. So really what you're seeing is a score out of 500. So in this document, right, where we talk about the source of income protection, you can see here it achieved 81.05% of the potential total, and it was the highest score by a lot, right? That gives this sort of equation is what ultimately informed the score that you see here, and we repeat that for each intervention. So we wanted to give the community an understanding of where these things came from, and also for any given intervention, you can back out the math. And I didn't think it would be useful to go much further than a tool like this, because in each of these, if you simply divide by the weight, you will get people's average score. Trying to represent the average score for each of these things, and Patty and I had this conversation, there was another way that we displayed it, looked way too bizarre. It was so detailed that it was better to break it out into a separate document and keep it simple for the purposes of the reports display. However, any of these interventions, right, if you divide this number by 16.2, you'll understand what the average score is, if that makes sense. Okay. Before we move on, any question about how to read the scores? Did that make sense? Thoughts or feedback? Okay. I always love it when I can get through a formula pretty quickly. All right, prioritizations. So when we talk about this, the action plan is a plan that sets the agenda for the standing committee ultimately. And we'll get into our recommendations, which are different than prioritizations. And what we wanted to do is remind people of what are we looking at, how are we organizing this information, and then some key numbers from the assessment. If you remember these columns, we put them together. Here are the big stats that we pulled out that are good to keep in mind when we think about some of the issues or items that were highlighted. So before we move on, did this make sense? Do you have any questions about why we set the stage up this way? Dr. Heckman, I see you're unmuted, but it just might be because you have a nice headphone, so.
Yes, I have a nice headphone, that's why.
Great. All right. So moving on.
Hey, Lauren, could I ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
Can you just talk a little bit more? I was reading through this and I was sort of, it would be helpful for me to hear you say again, like why these are the key assessment numbers. Like, can you just articulate that again?
Yeah, so the reason why we pulled these out had to deal with our process at Community Solutions when we did the affinity diagramming, where we saw certain overlaps or where we saw big numbers stick out, right? That highlighted significant issues. For example, that half of Black households had incomes under 25,000. Like that is a significant stat that stands in contrast to the general sort of population number. So we wanted to highlight specific things, and these are the ones that we just essentially curated. Of course, the assessment is much deeper than that, and has a lot more data available, but we thought re-highlighting these key stats was useful and also visually interesting, to be frank. But I'm open to like renegotiating exactly that. We could just say, don't forget to check out the report, or if you think there's a better way to do it.
No, I think it's really helpful. I just think it's important to call that out a little bit more in the explanation of it, just because I was looking at it and I was reading through the language of it, and it wasn't like, for some reason in my brain, it wasn't like helping me to understand that this was that these statistics were really being identified as being significant, either because they demonstrated like a serious issue within the community, or it was something that needed to be called out of the report. And so I think that if you can, I think the visual is helpful. I think it's just important to just provide a little bit more context about why it's being called out.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, we can do that. And we'll send another update too. So that's helpful, thank you. Any other questions or comments before we move on? Okay. All right, economic stability. So what we did here is we provided additional assessment context, just the quick summary, and then the overall scores, right? Now the language here and how we curated this, we didn't want to edit too much. However, as anybody who has ever texted or used the English language before knows, sometimes it's not always perfectly done. So we just really try to focus in on things like grammar or making sure the concepts were identifiable enough. And we didn't want to impose too much of our meaning as Community Solutions on those concepts. So with that, right, regulating absentee landlords and neglectful homeowners, one of our lowest ranked items, right, is something that the city technically already does. But also, what does that mean necessarily? It's a sort of a shorthand sentence. So with all of these brainstorm ideas or concepts, it's just something that points to a direction of, well, someone identified this somewhere in the community, right? But overall, the most important items that came out were the City Foundation's Partner with Local Organization for short-term financial assistance. We saw that people were pretty income insecure, particularly like female-headed households with children. Like, so is that an area to explore? Lakewood has limited shelter capacity for the unhoused and could develop additional space. Someone brought out the guest house at Fairhill Partners. Again, this gets back to, we should probably engage, or the governance group should probably engage Fairhill Partners to learn more about the model. Does it have applicability, or does it not have applicability? Are there alternatives? That sort of thing. Have health and human service resources available at school open houses. Potentially a good idea. I think Laura and Emmy would probably need to be a part of those conversations, or maybe they already do that. But the community not knowing something, by the way, also points to something that you can address right through this group. So how do we make this information more readily available? Before we move on to the next section, any questions about this section?
Lauren, I've got a question. It's not necessarily just about this section, but a question.
Yeah, that's fine.
What I don't yet understand if these actions did Community Solutions take, say, 10 people sort of said the same thing and put it together in a suggested action, or did just one person suggest each of these? And could you make it LCSC, not CSC? Just please.
Yes.
Thank you.
That is a easy edit to make. So it's a little bit of both, to answer your question.
Okay.
In some cases, people said the same idea. But for the most part, it was a lot of independent ideas. And I think that also speaks to how a charrette enables endorsement or a lack of endorsement, because people really did, the most activity we saw in the charrette process was not suggesting ideas. It was offering feedback on other ideas. So, it was people going through other folks and saying yes or no. And that's why when we sent you that information, we included things like 14 yes, 2 no, because it gives you a sense of where the rest of the community was. For the most part, we didn't combine unless it was the exact same idea or very specific. I think there was only like 2 or 3 instances where we combined language.
So overall, there's like 50 ideas from 50 people, sort of.
Essentially, there's about, and let's be very specific about it, right? There are 39 folks who participated in the online charrette, and there were 19 folks who participated in the in-person. There were 59 individual ideas in the in-person, some of the ideas, for example, there was like a young kid who said more people in Lakewood. That can't necessarily translate to something meaningful. So there were some instances where like people's participation either didn't make sense or it was like a broken sentence, that sort of thing. But essentially, I would say probably between 50 and 70 people offering roughly around 50 ideas.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. And we can add something to that. To that effect, to make it clear, like how were the ideas represented.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, good idea. Thank you. Let's see. Yes, need comments, please, or have, let's see. Yes, comments, please, or have them in errors. We can add to our data file that rough file that we sent in the survey as a part of that work. If you would like, we can just include like what we sent to you as like the rough language, and we can even include pictures and a full summary of both the virtual and the in-person so people can see the totality of those ideas as a part of the final report. Laura, I see your virtual hand.
So I think mine's in line with Trish. I know when I did this, it took me several hours to complete it.
Yeah. And
I think some of the struggle was, I guess I wasn't aware of the meeting before when that went out or editing it. I feel like some of the questions were pretty raw and or some of the actions were pretty raw. and there was actions that were pretty much saying the same thing, but a little bit differently, or actions that were so specific that
it's hard to evaluate.
Right. And I guess it's those comments. And I think, and I've talked to other people who did this, who even within their comments spurred other action items, but you didn't take those as action items.
I'm not sure. You mean like when there seemed to be so much alignment that we sort of combine them? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess it was the 50 ideas that we had. There was a lot of them that conflicted, or there was ones that needed more information, or obviously you stated already, like, obviously it's a program that's already happening, so that tells us we need to communicate it better. But I know that within it, then you had all those comments, and I think we want to make sure we get all those comments from all those action items, because some of those comments may actually lead to an action that we can do as a standing committee. So I guess I'm just wanting to make sure that we get all those comments, and how do we handle some of these conflicting ones and ones that are inaccurate.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I would say a couple of things. We will make sure that the full totality of the charrette collection process is also available to the larger group as a part of the report. So you will get visual representation of the boards. You will get essentially a printout of the virtual version, and I will also pull down the survey so that you have information on endorsements, lack of endorsements, as a supplemental material to try to represent it in the report. I think I sort of learned that lesson and we learned that lesson with the assessment, that if you overload the visual or the representation of it and don't curate it enough, people are like, what is this saying exactly? But that being said, I think it's important that that information become available for the standing committee and that they know how to use it. And of course, we would make ourselves available beyond this contract to help facilitate that process until there's a certain level of comfort. So I think what we could do too is like, I would love to talk to you, especially because part of our suggestion here is having the sort of leadership of that standing committee include Health and Human Services and Planning, and talk about how do we pull these materials together in a meaningful way so that when you're moving forward, you feel comfortable about, well, here's what the community said, here's what the exact language was, here's what the endorsement numbers were, here's what our score was, and you can take all that information.
And that obviously is going to include all the comments then from those of us who had to complete the action item prioritization survey.
Oh, yes. So you'll have all the data that we asked you to everything that we asked you to fill out, and all the information that you provided us will be readily available. It's just one of those things of that's very useful for the standing committee, may not be as useful for the general public, right?
Right. And I guess that's where I'm looking at it, is knowing, having that information. Okay.
Oh yeah. And sorry if I'm shifting a lot. I walked outside on my deck and bit it real hard. So
it's all good.
I'm good. You know, just I'll go to the great osteopathic program at Lakewood Family Medicine.
Hey, Lauren, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So as with any study, when it lands on your desk, you want to evaluate if this is generalizable to a large population.
Yeah.
So Lakewood is 50,000 people, give or take. Let's assume there were 50 people, and there were more, I know 70, but a nice easy number is 50. So that's 1 in 1,000 offering an opinion.
Yes.
How can I take this and generalize that to how do we feel that this is capturing the sentiments and the will of 50,000 people?
That's a great question. Do you always feel that your congressperson represents your opinions? You don't have to answer that.
I don't know. Well, so you're saying that's politics. So you're saying this.
I think part of it is the assessment process, the need process right, has that rigor of the statistical soundness around, we know statistically speaking, this is a representative voice of what the challenges are. The what to do about it part, we try to keep as open as possible so that people can vote, right, for ideas or weigh in on those ideas. The governance structure then becomes eminently important, and how the standing committee governs itself and stays publicly facing is really meant to be that accountability piece. Because of course, there is not going to be a rational possibility that a single person per 1,000 people can accurately represent the needs and thoughts and opinions of the entire community, or even of 1,000 people. So how the continued participation to move from 50 to 70 people to hundreds of people relies on the ability of the advisory committee to essentially be a representative body of the community, work within its institutions and through its networks of power to then manage new ideas and new interventions that impact more people. So, you know, your patient panel, right, is how big? Like 1,000 or so, right? And how you might manage something like
about
that.
2,000, yeah.
About 2,000. Mm-hmm. Some of that means that there's going to be an asynchronous aspect to how these things get addressed. Some of it's about, because it's public, it's an open invitation for the community to more regularly participate. And that's why it's so important too, to focus in on how things get communicated. I agree with you. Something like even the source of income law piece, right? That idea, although highly scored, may not be something that even everybody knows what it is. There might even just be a few hundred people who even understand that contextually in the city of Lakewood. But what it does is it enables you to say, okay, we found that this statistically meaningful base of people identified housing as a need. Here's how many people were specifically housing insecure from census data and from that survey data. Here is the values. Here are the values that this organization of interests, both in terms of lay folks and folks representing institutions, thought were important values to understanding those issues. And then here are what some suggestions from the community were. And then here's this public entity to review those ideas and invite the community to weigh in. It's not a perfect system, and it's not a representative system, but it's as close as I think we can probably get without fully polling the entire community on each of these things.
Yeah, so I guess in a political system, you would have a vote and people would vote, and that would get the representation of the majority that way.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, and specifically, like with that source of income protection example, that's something that requires city council action, right? And administration implementation. And so those folks are still beholden to their wards, to the public, to the people who actually vote. So they'll make sure that if they're not satisfied with pursuing that gets teased out through the institutional mechanisms that are supposed to be accountable to that process too. But it's a fair point to make. I see, Patty, you have your hand up too.
Yeah, so I wonder if maybe it's a good reminder to talk about, since this is like the second piece, the second phase of the project, how all of the surveys and all of those voices have been incorporated into this piece. Because I think that if we're talking about the 70 people who took a survey or showed up at the charrette, that's actually not representative of how many people actually weighed in. So maybe that's talking about how we've used that might be a good reminder.
Yeah, and yet intentionally, your study looked at trauma-informed care and voices of small groups of people and considered them equal to population surveys. And so you have inherent things that you're doing because you're having a small group of people who've been amplified. By design, that was
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I am a person who likes the fact that, our democracy also protects the interests of folks who don't represent the majority of folks' interests, right? And that's what you would hope in a process like this. But it's a good point to highlight. I think, Patty, what we could do too to Dr. Heckman's point, is tease out how some of these ideas or concepts were developed through the assessment, and maybe elevate more of the methodology behind the assessment as being inclusive, and remind folks of the statistical basis for the need assessment as a part of this.
Yeah, Lauren, it's Trish. The underserved are really, I mean, these comments really don't reflect the population that we serve at all. You know, I mean, our people probably don't know what the Ranger Education Foundation, you know, it's troubling to me.
Well, that's a good point too. I think what I would say with that is,
I mean, the reason I bring it up is the percentage. You know, if you look at the prioritization, the percentages you pull out on this prioritization page, that say 50% of Black households earn less than that's a large number of people, and those people don't show up here.
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree with that. I mean, I think, first of all, this idea of short-term financial assistance, health and human service resource availability for open houses, subsidized vouchers for families, like a lot of these get to income supports. But I would go beyond that to say, Trish, that's why this implementation body is so important. So if I go back to,
I think that the thoughts are there for sure, but I think they're not coming from, they're coming from people observing this. And that's hard. That's really hard. You know, I saw some comments that said, you know, we want affordable housing, but don't build apartment buildings in my neighborhood. You know, the NIMBYism is strong. And it just, I know I harp at this, but this is the world that I'm living in and the people I'm responsible for.
Yeah, that's why I'm very excited to nominate you to the standing committee, because I think it will be really important that...
I just heard Dave's head hit his desk.
No, not at all.
No, it's the world we all live in. Unfortunately, I think it's a lot of things that I come across, at least in my experience in Lakewood, is that there's a million great ideas, but just so long as it's not in my front yard.
Exactly. Yeah. And I saw that more specifically in the comments. And, you know, we scored all this, but look who we are. You know, it's takes me back to the very, very beginning of this whole process, you know, when we did the Lakewood, you know, so I just think we have to keep it really in mind. And as we're moving forward to implementing anything, or suggesting ways that these things can be implemented, those voices have to come to to the process somehow.
I totally agree.
And we can do that. We can do that in a next phase. But I just want everybody, you know, it's critical to the city.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you know, when we get to the recommendations section, I want to highlight some of that accommodation. But one thing I'll say to build on your point, Trish, is you now have, as opposed to having good ideas that get killed because people feel a certain way about them, the thing that makes it different once you move towards the standing committee phase is you will not only have a group of organizations who have collective power to say, hey, we can push these ideas, and these ideas are implementable and realistic, and we can bring experts and we can talk about it. But you also have a really rich set of data that can help describe to some of those folks who may not be as willing or who may need to be confronted with some of the hard evidence to suggest, hey, this is a problem. We all agree it's a problem in our community. Our survey says that we are a certain way. But then when we talk to our residents, you know, our Black and Brown residents, our neighbors, they don't feel or have the same experience statistically or qualitatively. And we need to do something about that. And to me, that's a very persuasive thing that doesn't always exist in communities, and what the power of this process could represent if executed well. But I think you're exactly right. I think there needs to be representation from the broader community in the standing committee process. to work alongside institutional partners, because that's how you get things done. It's a good, great point. I'm just looking around to see. All right. So let me just mention here, because we have about 25 minutes scheduled, I'm available for longer if needed. You kind of get the idea of what each of these prioritized lists are all about. Is there anything within any of these prioritized lists that folks want to call out specifically or discuss?
Lauren, the only thing I was going to say is that, I guess in my experience in working on requirements development and some of those things is, I was going to go through these actions and just, I'm cautious also to kind of not try to like over intervene with language that's already been kind of pulled from surveys and other things, but there is value sometimes in genericizing some of them.
Okay.
Where I've always just been cautious in requirements development to, when you start identifying specific organizations sometimes to do very specific things, sometimes that limits your flexibility then in implementation to say, well, you know, like the one, I was just looking at the one action, like the city of Lakewood could subsidize vouchers for families. If you put that in there, is the city of Lakewood the only organization that can subsidize vouchers in that circumstance? Or do you look at that action, that requirement, and what is really the heart of that action or that need? Is it that families, you know, accessing food packs through whatever that they need subsidies?
Mm-hmm.
Is that you know, you kind of start to, it's like that root cause, like you start going down to what is the root issue that needs to be solved under that action. And again, I'm not like going in and trying to rewrite every single one of these, but you know, as the guy that's going to probably get implementation pushed forward, sometimes when, you know, using that, the implementation evaluation matrix that I came up with, or that from like we have an area where you start to look at the organizations that could potentially contribute or lead that effort. And you want to be careful about hamstringing yourself or limiting your own flexibility by saying, well, the action plan said the city of Lakewood, like, and so that's just an example.
All right.
But some of these things is just, it's important to kind of go through these actions and look at them from a generic standpoint of like, what is the underlying need that this action is trying to remedy? Sometimes it's that specific language that comes from a survey or a comment or the charrette can be very pointed. But I mean, it's like the, you know, please provide I'm looking at the wrong one here. Sorry. Like Lakewood has limited its shelter capacity for the unhoused and could develop additional space. Like I get that, like citing the examples of the guest house at Fairfield and the breathing room and stuff like that. But sometimes like even that could be too specific. Like, what is the issue? Is it shelter capacity for the unhoused? Is it shelter capacity in larger residential units, like a 4-bedroom house or something like what is the underlying issue that we're trying to get after with this? I just, that sometimes that's just one of those things that, you know, at first glance through here, that when you're trying to implement actions that are very specific, sometimes it's like, well, if the city says, hey, we can't subsidize vouchers, it's like, okay, set that one aside.
Like, I agree, Dave. When I finished this whole thing, I think I put a comment in my survey is, it looks like the city of Lakewood's got a lot of work on their hands, because a lot of this comes back to the city, and it doesn't have to, or maybe it doesn't, the city can't, I don't know. But I walked away thinking the city is responsible for an awful lot of these actions, the way these comments are written.
And please don't view it that I'm trying to like
no.
I don't.
Like,
I mean, I'm taking the opposite tack, Dave. You know, that the city shouldn't be responsible for everything that goes on in the city.
So
go ahead.
So I think, Dave, your comments are well received. I'd say a couple of things. Number one is we should likely reframe what these comments are and talk about them as comments. These are like more like quotes than they are specific concepts across the board. That's the first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is the reason why the city of Lakewood is likely mentioned so much is because it's the most powerful partner and the one financing the project. So people probably entered into it thinking, well, this is a city of Lakewood thing. And then the third part is I want to add a whole section here on governance that I think will be really important. And so what would be helpful to me and to us before we publish is a sense of what that governance needs to look like from a city empowered entity being the standing committee, because that's where that came from. So I think the exact conversation you are having right now is what should happen in the standing committee. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, as you're going through this list, you can say, well, listen, what's the actual need here? Are we thinking about this? And you can bring housing providers and you can invite folks from guest house and talk about their model, and you can talk to housing experts. And it's a way to platform these concepts and investigate them. It's not a mandate or a shopping list of what you need to do. Now, obviously, the city of Lakewood's highlighted a lot here. A number of other organizations are highlighted a lot, but that's, to me, I wouldn't want to go too far in making the suggestions too generic, but rather would suggest that the best place to have exactly the dialogue you're having is in that standing committee, because it can reveal things to lots of partners at the same time. And to me, why I think that's true. When we had our focus groups, there was often times where people were just sharing information about programs, city operations, funding opportunities, business connections that they didn't have before because there wasn't a forum to deliberate on those issues. So similarly, I think your point is something like that. Lakewood has limited shelter capacity is something that could be brought up. Like when this gets on the agenda item, you could say, well, here's what our shelter capacity is. Who are the people who are providing that? Trish, like, do you see this as a need? Let's go back to the data and see what housing and security numbers look like. Who are the other partners that we need to bring to the table to talk this through or like think through the opportunity? Hey, Kate, when you go through your funding request, this seems to be like a legitimate thing. Could we talk about maybe like issuing a RFP together around improving shelter capacity in the city of Lakewood or creating opportunities for housing security that try to address this issue? So the answers or the solutions may manifest themselves completely different than what is being suggested in the idea. And that's really what that is intended to do. Patty, I see you have your hand up, and then Laura.
Yeah, just to underscore something that you said, Lauren, around the idea that, I also, because you're including community voice, I think it's important to retain it in this stage, knowing that it's going to become something else. So treating it as quotes, I think, is perfect. So we can very easily change these headers. But I do think that if you all are reading through it and you're like, wow, the city of Lakewood comes up and these other organizations come up, but wow, these other organizations don't, and they're doing this work, I think that will kind of help highlight, again, what your residents expect from whom and what the communication is like. So it'll tell you who knows about what programs and who doesn't. So by leaving it very specific, it kind of becomes universal, because then you can figure out like who knows about what's happening and who doesn't, and where do we need to do a better job of communicating that. So again, that implementation piece is going to be, I love that you guys are going through and already kind of trying to parse this out, but kind of like, yeah, this is sort of what launches into that.
Yeah, and before I get to you, Laura, I think I want to highlight one of your comments here. Laura saying, I've been going through the actions and breaking down and categorizing parties who may want to be a part of the action. Something that could happen as advance work before even that first meeting, or maybe immediately following that first meeting, is like doing some homework of, okay, so we're just going to focus in on these first 5-10 items. If you know people who are doing this work, who are they? What resources are they bringing to bear? How do we want to learn more about this? Because another thing that's really powerful about this is it's sort of like a table of tables, to where it's an opportunity for all of you as partners to learn about these resources. I can see, for example, with Dr. Heckman and Lakewood Family Medicine, they might be a significant recipient of a lot of useful data and information about community resources that they don't necessarily have access to today. And similarly, they could come back to say, hey, no, we can do that. If there's a public health need in this following area, we can try to manage that. But Laura, what did you have to say?
I was just echoing what you said. I mean, I think, once I got this, I started to look and break it down. Kind of, I guess I was echoing what Dave said. I was trying to do this and already thinking of knowing what we have going forward and breaking down who needs to be a part of it. And and I think I was like doing what Dave was. I'm like, I need to like look at it a little bit differently. And then I started to like freak out for Dave's sake. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is way too much on the city, and like thinking for myself. But then I was like, wait, we're not alone. This is all. And then it came to Trish. So I was just echoing that. And I think I'm just at that point where I'm anxious to get to the next step.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm excited to hear that. Anytime like, a governmental administration's like, yeah, let's dig into community ideas, that gets me excited. But that's a good point. Okay. Hey,
Marianne.
Yeah, Marianne.
Sorry, so my hand doesn't show up there. So just this document will be public, right? I mean, yes. Available. So my concern, maybe in support of David's concerns, is by calling out certain organizations of the city of Lakewood, is that it could be a distraction, like that the immediate reaction internally or externally could be, that's impossible, or that's, what are they thinking? Or, that the conversation would go that direction instead of at the heart of the suggestion put forth. So for instance, like number 4, and I have no idea where the city, resources would be, but if the suggestion was just subsidized vouchers to families already accessing, if that was the comment, subsidized vouchers, then the conversation would be, who would do that? That's a good idea. Who would do that? It was scored kind of, instead of like, I could just see the conversation going to, how would the city do that? And then how can we afford that? And who's going to pay for it? And who's, well, that's my 2 cents. I'm concerned about assigning the organization, and I know we're not, but reflecting that would serve as a distraction from the core issue.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But that's part of what happens with community voice, right? The challenge you would run into is if you don't have a certain level of specificity, or if you make it too generic, then it becomes less meaningful, right? It's not as clear what's being suggested. But your point is a sound one, and I think that's why the implementation tool, right, is a key part of this, because when it comes to thinking about how this public body commonly understands the root causes of an issue and then goes through potential solutions, it is this tool that can then help score those concepts and ideas, or some version of it. I think part of it is there will be a lot of no's or not possibles. There will also be a lot of yeses, or there will be a lot of buts, ands, and that sort of thing. Like I was trying to say at the beginning, like being creative is kind of difficult, especially when you're talking about public approaches, community-driven approaches to changing things, institutions, structures, laws. It is not a clean process. It is a messy process. You will receive negative feedback. That's just an element of this type of work. But you get good ideas. You're confronting things. That was the intent of this. You're not just assessing them, you're confronting them and trying to re-engineer them. And with that re-engineering process, I think it's okay if the city of Lakewood says, I don't know if we can't do that, or we'll need additional resources, or we already do that. All of these things if anything, in all likelihood, it's going to engender more community trust because you're doing that sort of deliberation in the public way. Okay. But if there are specific suggestions, Dave, Marianne, anyone else, about how to improve those pieces of language, I'm open to it. And two, if as like a larger committee, you're saying we need to remove all individual citations of organizations, this is your project. I understand that. My recommendation would be to not do that, and instead to highlight in the governance process that any organization, represented or not on the standing committee, be involved in the process before any sort of implementation evaluation takes place. And I'd also just want to highlight that, the suggestion here in terms of structure is to empower the city's planning and health and human service departments to help guide that process alongside city council with all of you and other members of the advisory committee to create that institutional vetting and support process. You should see this as a multi-year effort. This is not quick, simple work. This is hard, iterative work. If there was a way that I could hand you something in 18 months to solve all of Lakewood's problems, I would charge you a whole lot more money. But you're getting that. Okay.
Maybe we should talk about how much more.
I don't know if there is money like that. I don't, because that sort of thing doesn't exist, right? This is continuous improvement.
Right.
You're always building on it.
Right.
So just trying to respect a little bit of the time here. Going into the recommendations, I think we've talked about this, but and this gets into the typos, right? First of all, you need a permanent body, a standing committee that reviews these things, discusses them, and deliberates them. And where I would need help, Laura and Dave in particular, is what are the limitations of governance? What would you want to see as necessary components of governance? But I would take that same recommendation from anyone here, and we will add that to this report because I think it's a really key piece that's currently missing. I'd also say that it should meet at least quarterly. I know that we talked about maybe like every 6 months or so. I think quarterly gives you some sense of momentum and you can reevaluate it as you move forward. I think number two, the implementation tool. While you have good scores for prioritizing things, there are going to be situations where you can't always implement things because of practical operational limits. It may score well, the community may support it, but if it's not possible, it's good to translate why it's not possible and give people that reason. And so this implementation tool document should also be a publicly facing document so that when you're going through things, you can say, hey, listen, we don't have this. And similarly, other communities that did this, for example, use a similar sort of tool, and then they would reference it when they went back to the community to ask for things, right? And this is not my suggestion explicitly or specifically, but one of the cities we looked at used a process like this to promote a tax increase for a specific use because they did not have the resources. So you can use this data to try to put it back out to the public. And that gets to Dr. Heckman's point about how do you make sure you're inclusive and how do you actually go to a vote? If you need more significant resources, that's a way to do it. Also orients what type of focuses you should have. If the city of Lakewood is working with the county, for example, on opioid settlement dollars, or they're doing their own thing with opioid settlement dollars, want to experiment around behavioral health, it's a way to say, well, maybe this is one idea from this plan that we can try to address. The final thing here is improving the communications. And this is what gets into our next section, right? I think that the standing committee should also be paying attention. Can you repeat
that? Sorry.
Yeah. Improving communications. So one of the, in addition to going through these ideas and having the discussions that we're having around, does this make sense? What's the root cause? That sort of thing. Also trying to figure out a way to talk about this work in an ongoing fashion. should always be a part of this work. And you should always have an eye towards, I didn't know about that resource, or no, we do have shelter capacity, or, well, that's a program that the food bank is operating. That sort of thing then enables you to promote that information within the community. So I think that's going to be one of the key tasks of the committee beyond the specific vetting of ideas or looking at the data in regards to the assessment. So that is the totality of the action plan. I think we have some work and some edits. I would still take those edits. Our plan is to go to mid January before a full release. Let me just go back to our slide deck here. So that we can talk about next steps. So, communicating the work. As before, we're going to develop materials and messaging documents. We'll make sure that all of you get that. So social media stuff, ways to talk about the work. If you have thoughts about that, if you have concerns about that or questions, how do we discuss it or anything like that, let us know. Similarly, we are, Dave reached out about making a presentation to City Council sometime in January. I think we're still working out what that date is.
Yeah,
but
it's the 23rd or the 30th. I'm waiting to hear back. Okay. Probably the 23rd.
Okay. Beyond that, though, and I know we've made presentations to several groups here, like the Lakewood Community Services Center and some of the foundations. We're happy to do that again. We're happy to share these results. So if we need to be places, if we need to create another community forum to say, here's what happened. If you need us to present at the first standing committee meeting, we will do it. Because even though, like, you know, we're 15 days away from our contract expiring, we want to make sure this is meaningful. It's important to us that this is useful. So think about opportunities for us to communicate the work. And like I said, we're aiming for public release in mid-January. Patty, before I move on, do you have any thoughts on this, or did I cover everything?
Yeah, I think as far as the edits that you and I can talk about that are really easy, those are easy to implement, and then just we can be in conversation about how other things develop. But and I know that, yeah, as we get into, well, maybe you can help me with this. So once the Ebony and I can develop the social and the announcement sort of stuff once it's public, or do you want us to be working on that like when we come back from the holidays, just to have it ready the day of? Got it.
More of the latter. And if we need to take time, especially with our partners at the city and the foundations, we need to take time about when we can do that, because I realize, you know, we need to get the formality of it figured out. But yes, I think we want to have it all as a release, do a press statement, that sort of thing. Additionally, one thing is we are currently hosting all of the information at Community Solutions. At some point, we need to hand that off. So we will continue to host, but something that we'll need from the city or from our partners is, where do we want this information to live? Recordings, documents, the data file, all of that stuff. You know, we want to be able to provide that to you. And two, when you have the standing committee, then you have a place where standing committee materials can be posted. So something to think about. We're happy to host until that gets figured out. Any questions on the communications part?
So I guess next steps, Dave, is that just us?
Yeah, we'll keep like Lauren said, I got to work through some edits or recommendations on this document, and then I really got to get on the like a draft charter and some other things for the standing committee, and then figure out in advance of that council meeting in January, I got to figure out my my Jedi mind trick on how to get this thing implemented without it being like way too overly complicated, which is going to be the challenge in front of council, is they're going to want to make it their own baby in this election year of 2023 when everyone is up for election. So I'm trying to make it simple and straightforward, and something that we can manage internally here and keep it moving. without a whole bunch of political speed bumps. So
whatever you need from us over here
yep.
at Cove. And we know the partners around the table, I guess, that we need to bring on.
Yeah, I fully anticipate. I'm just going to continue to, I think, as we just continue to use the kind of the committee structures that we've got, and and as long as I can continue to sustain them before the wheels come off. So, yeah.
And that's something to consider too. I don't know to what extent there's a willingness or desire to support the work of the city by bringing in maybe some level of professionalized support to help keep it organized. But I know that we had some conversations about that, Kate. So I don't know what the openness is there, but maybe particularly with the steering committee members after this project ends, maybe we have one more conversation about, so how does this actually get managed? And that can happen before city council.
Yeah, that's an important, I mean, that's part of, I guess that's what I'm thinking through, Lauren, is that the critical piece of this is not only kind of what that standing committee looks like, but that there's got to be it's a transition plan, basically, as you transition from these two standing committees and this contractual organization into what that new standing committee that sits with the city, who's participating in it. I mean, we kind of went a little bit with Live Well Lakewood when they ended, and we kind of had a little bit of outreach in terms of like, hey, is anyone interested in continuing like with this? And the pandemic totally destroyed that, but we did have, I think we had like one or two meetings with a select group from Live Well Lakewood as we were kind of thinking about this whole effort. But that, not a great example, but that's the transition from our current existing structure into this new structure is going to be, I got to put some thought behind that.
Okay. And we're happy, depending on timing, including whatever is appropriate to include in this action plan versus having it be a follow-up or further communicated. So just let us know. Okay. Last bit, closing out the work. Do you like that? A little heart. Thank you. Gonna send out one more survey, but it'll be the last survey, which is, we just want to hear from you. Okay. We have received a lot of interest in similar sort of work. And it's a learning experience, right? As much as I would like to say, I feel like we were perfect in our execution, that's not true. And obviously, there are things where we can learn from our experience collectively with you. And so we want to know, what did you think? What could have been better? If now that we've gone through the process, knowing that process, what did you like? What did you didn't like? What would you want to see changed? And I think we're going to be reaching out to several of you to like interview you about your ideas about here's where, we think things went well or where things could have been different. But I will say this, for us, it was a really great experience. We do this sort of thing for lots of different types of communities. Lakewood is unique in that it asked for an action plan. It asked for something that said, okay, we're ready to like shake things up. That I think you should all hold and communicate around as being pretty special. And I think it speaks to the type of community that Lakewood actually is, despite anything that this process may have told us about in terms of, some of the challenges. I think one thing that really stuck out to me, more so than I would have thought, is just how committed the residents are to making Lakewood the community it is and the community it wants to be. I also just want to take a moment and thank everybody at Community Solutions who helped us with this process, but also particularly you, Dave, and Laura from the city. And Chad, please express my thanks to him and to everyone at the city for all of their help and support throughout this process. I also just want to highlight, this is like an example of government doing good public stuff. So for anybody else, just remind yourselves, like, government can do some pretty cool stuff. And then, for anybody here, your participation and just generally speaking, I think that there's a unique opportunity here to do some innovative things and things that will just make Lakewood even better. So I think I speak for myself, for Patty, for our entire team, and saying thank you for the opportunity to do it. This isn't like a final goodbye, but given the fact this is our final sort of formal organizing conversation, I just thought it was important to say thank you for the opportunity, and also to congratulate you on what it was a lot of work that got done. So thank you for that. Okay, I will stop pontificating. We're 4 minutes past. Any closing thoughts, questions, things that are kind of burning a hole in your pocket?
Profound thanks. Thank you, Lauren. Your leadership is so incredibly impressive, and the process equally so. I personally feel lucky to have been part of this process and to be exposed to the work of Community Solutions in such an intimate way, and to you personally. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Well, and I'll be around. I'm still going to help, so Community Solutions, I like them so much, I work for them for free. So I'll let you know if there's anything I need. You should see more communications from us. Please send us any more feedback that you have over, the next week or so. Community Solutions will be out of our office from the 23rd through the end of the year. But as I mentioned, I'm no longer with Community Solutions, so always feel free to reach out. And then when we get back to the new year, we'll sort of finalize things and get out something that's publicly facing and work with you all to do that. So thanks again. Have a great holiday and a happy new year. And thanks, Emily Mattilla, our research director. She came on.
Thank you, Emily.
Yes, I did also want to come on because Lauren keeps saying he's leaving, which I guess is true apparently, but that I am still going to be at Community Solutions and I know how to reach Lauren really well. So one, I can probably answer most of the questions, and if not, I quickly like to. So rest assured, you will still have all your issues resolved with us.
Yes, and just in case you need it, I'm going to put Emily's email in our chat. Just so.
Can I ask a quick technical question, which is that I still have a steering committee meeting for all of us on the 21st. And I just wanted to ask if that was still happening, just because I didn't want to miss. I wanted just to make sure I was correct on that.
Yeah, I left it. I was going to ask if you wanted to keep it, given this conversation today, totally up to the steering committee.
Okay.
I feel like we have most of our stuff. I would suggest probably waiting until January to talk about communications. And so what I would like to do is maybe follow up and figure out a good time for that.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. So no steering committee next week. I will send out a cancellation. We'll get something else scheduled. Okay.
Thank you.
This has been a really iterative and just affirming process. And I'm just grateful to have been part of it. And I just am thankful for everybody's leadership in this, because you have shepherded, what could be, a relatively contentious process into one that I think has really strengthened relationships and built our capacity to work together. And so I'm just really grateful for the leadership that's been, exemplified from everyone here, and I'm grateful to be part of it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate.
Thank
and
you.
I echo. So, all right, y'all. I will stop recording and we can adjourn. Thank you for all your time. We'll post this soon. And you know where to find us. Thanks again.
Thank
Happy
you.
2023,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a great
Holidays.
holiday.
Thanks.